Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Access and Interpret the MRA Report. This is the second in a two-part series of training videos on the measurable results assessment. In part one, we talked about how to set up and administer the MRA. Now we're going to talk about how do you actually access the results once the survey has been completed and interpret those results. So recall that in part one, we talked about the end in mind of the MRA is to measure the results of our work in Leader in Me in leadership, culture, and academics. In other words, this is the get part of the See-Do-Get framework. And specifically, the results that we are measuring with the MRA are the Leader in Me school competency measures, the measures that you see in the box at the bottom half of this slide. So you can see that there are 8 overall school competency measures that we gather data on through the MRA. So now the school has completed the MRA and is ready to look at the results. So on the home page of leaderinme.com, we're going to click on the MRA button to access those results. So as we do that, that will take us to the MRA home screen. And here we see a lot of useful data. And we're going to explore this data piece by piece. First of all, we see that there are a variety of buttons on the upper right half of this home screen. Today, we'll look at 4 of those buttons that will help us interpret the results. So let's begin with the first one, the button labeled Details. This provides a summary of how many people actually took the MRA survey. We can see it's divided into the 3 major stakeholder groups. So we see the number of students who took the survey, the number of staff members, and the number of parents. And remember that in order to improve the reliability of this data, the more surveys, the better. And so the recommendation was that we survey at least 80% of the students in grade levels 4 through 9, at least 80% of the full-time staff members, and at least 20% of the parents or guardians associated with the school. Now, the next button we see is the scoring guide. And when we click on that, we get this pop-up box. This tells us how we can interpret the numbers that we see throughout the MRA. So let's start at the bottom of this scoring guide. If we look at the bottom of this guide, we can see that a score that is between 90 and 100 is considered a highly effective score. This is a significant strength for the school. So any number above 90 can be considered to be a very high result. Then a score between 80 and 89 is also considered to be an effective result, meaning this is also a strength of the school, something they're doing quite well in. When we receive a score between 70 and 79, that indicates a moderately effective result. And in this case, that means there's probably some areas of the particular measure we're looking at that are in good shape, but also some that could be improved. So it's a mixed result and worth looking at. If we see a score between 50 and 69, this is something we want to look at further and definitely can use improvement. So this should be considered an area that might be part of our school improvement plan. And then anything below 50 would be a priority area that really needs immediate attention. And so we'd want to ensure that we look much more deeply at any area that is below 50 and determine how that fits into our school improvement plan. Now, to the left of the buttons at the top of this homepage, we see a variety of numbers that form the summary dashboard. So first of all, at the top, we see in a circle and the number 72. So this is the overall MRA score for this particular school. Now, that overall score was obtained by averaging the 3 overall scores in our leadership, culture, and academic categories. So each of those receives an overall score as well as an overall MRA score. Now, below the summary dashboard, we see a detailed dashboard, and that will give us much more information on the results within the leadership, culture, and academic categories. And we'll look at those in more detail now. So first of all, within each of these 3 categories, we can click on results of what we call the measures within each category. So within leadership, there are 3 individual measures, culture the same with 3 individual measures, and academics with 2 measures. Then each of those measures further subdivides into sub-measures. So when we look at this screen, we can see that within leadership, it divides into, the leadership category divides into 3 measures. The first being staff social emotional teaching readiness, the second being student leadership, and the final one being family involvement. And we see for each of these 3 measures, there is an overall score. The same is true of the culture measures and the academic measures. And again, there's 8 of those overall measures. And again, these are the school competency measures that we see here, 3 in leadership, 3 in culture, and 2 in academics. Now, we can further click on or look at the sub-measure data associated with each of these measures. So for example, the first measure under leadership is staff social emotional teaching readiness. When we click on that result, that brings us to a list of sub-measures. We can see that within staff social emotional teaching readiness, there are in fact 4 sub-measures. Now, next to each sub-measure is a question mark. And if we click on that question mark, we get a bunch of information about that sub-measure. First, we get a definition of what is included in that sub-measure. Then we get our data on the exact score that we have in that area. Then we see some example questions that come from the actual surveys that staff, student, and families completed. So we can see what types of questions were asked. Now also with these sub-measures, below each sub-measure, we can see 2 results. The first result is the score that we obtained in the previous MRA. Then the second result is the most recent MRA score. So this allows us to see, did we experience improvement? And in fact, if we look at the right-hand side of that sub-measure, we can see either a green or a red arrow. If it's a green up arrow, that indicates we showed improvement from the last MRA result. If it's a red down arrow, it indicates we decreased. And then it shows us how many percentage points we actually increased or decreased. So in this particular case, under school events, we went from a 63 to a 74, an increase of 11 percentage points. Now we can also see additional data about our leadership, culture, and academic measures. So if we click on the buttons that look like graphs next to each of those categories, we can see that 3 graphs show up. Those graphs are for individual measures. So we can click on any of the 3 leadership measures, the 3 culture measures, or the 2 academic measures and get a graph for that measure. That graph shows us our trend data over time. Now we can also compare ourselves to other Leader in Me schools. we see that below each measure, there are two checkboxes. The first one allows us to compare ourselves to all Lighthouse Leader in Me schools. So if we click that box, we can see a line appears that shows the average of all those schools. Now below that one, there's another checkbox that says show norms. This will compare our data to all Leader in Me schools, Lighthouse and non-Lighthouse schools. So a second line will show up. We can look at these individually or collectively, but this allows us to compare ourselves to other Leader in Me schools throughout the world. Now let's go back to our buttons on the home page, and we see there's a button here that says download PDF. This provides a very helpful school report that schools can actually download and print and share with others. If we look at that report, it's a 7-page document, and it begins with a cover page like you see here, telling us a little bit about what the MRA is and explaining the scoring guide so that the viewer knows how to interpret the scores. Then on the second page, we see the summary data. So we see the overall MRA score, the individual scores in the categories of leadership, culture, and academics, and then the individual scores of the 8 measures contained within those. And again, we can see whether the score went up or down from the previous MRA. Now on pages 3 through 7 of this report, we see the detailed view of all the sub-measure data. So here we see the sub-measures for 2 areas, 2 of the measures of leadership. And we can see again the explanation of what that sub-measure includes, as well as the previous and current MRA results. The other button we want to look at today says download report. This is very useful as we drill down even further into our MRA results. When we click on download report, this brings up an Excel spreadsheet of the by question results. So in other words, this is the report that we see. And at the bottom, we can see we have 4 tabs, an overview, and then a tab that allows us to see the actual student survey results, the staff survey results, and the parent survey results. Right now it's set on overview. So we can see, and in one page, we can see overall, how did we do in every category, measure, and sub-measure. So if we look at this, we can see a lot of useful data. Now there are 2 columns here for each of these categories, measures, and sub-measures. The first column indicates the overall score for that particular area. And then the second column indicates how many people contributed to the survey responses for the particular measure or sub-measure. So if we look, for example, under culture, and we look under the supportive environment measure, we see 75 people responded to questions having to do with supportive environment. And then that breaks down further into individual sub-measures, and we can see how many people responded to each of those sub-measures. Now let's remember that for the student surveys, there are 3 different random versions of the student surveys. So when a student clicks on the survey link to take the MRA, they're getting one of the 3 random versions. And this is to ensure that a student will be able to focus on and complete the question. So not every student is asked every question. And so you'll notice that the number of respondents is often 1/3 of the total number of students who took the MRA, because each different question is answered by 1/3 of the student population. Now we also, if we click on the individual either staff, student, or family results tab, then we can see this is where we get the individual by question results. So this allows us to do a very detailed analysis. If we wanted to probe an area that perhaps might be an area of growth for us, we can go to the by question data and understand exactly where it is we need to focus. That may cause us to identify certain habits, certain highly effective practices within a habit, or certain aspects of our culture or academic systems that particularly could use improvement. So the by question results are extremely helpful to identify exact areas of focus. Now, there is another button on the home screen that says Switch MRA. When a school has completed multiple MRAs, you are able then to access the data from a particular MRA. So we can see this school has 2 MRAs listed. So we could click on either one of those and the dashboards then would show us the data for that particular MRA. So it allows us to look back in the past at results we received previously. Now there's something new in the MRA that allows us now to see the responses in the open-ended questions at the end of the MRA surveys. So if someone added a free response, that response is listed verbatim, exactly as they shared it in this submitted responses part of the MRA. And so the responses here are accessible to administrators. So in other words, principals, assistant principals, head teachers, etc., or to Lighthouse coordinators. Those are the only people who can actually access the individual responses. And the responses are divided by student, staff, and parent data. Now, of course, because the survey is completely anonymous, there's no names or identifiable information associated with these responses. But you can see what it is people chose to write into the open-ended response questions. Now, if you'd like to know more about who responded to each particular submeasure, whose data was part of that submeasure, there's something on leaderandme.com called the MRA Submeasure Survey Source Infographic. And that allows us to see whose data was a part of each of these submeasures. So for instance, if we look under staff social emotional teaching readiness, because these are all submeasures having to do with staff perception, all of these come from the staff data. Whereas when we move into the student leadership measures, all of these have to do with student perception, but in some cases, also parent perception of their students. So we see in some cases, it includes questions answered by both students and parents, whereas some are just questions that were answered by students. And again, we can see for every submeasure who responded to the surveys, who were they intended to address. Now, you may be wondering, how are these measures and submeasures and category scores calculated? So let's look at the example here under our culture category. The first measure is supportive school environment. We see that divides into 4 submeasures. So the calculations are obtained by every individual MRA question is translated into a numerical score from 0 to 100. Then all of the responses to a particular question are averaged. And then all of the questions that are associated with a particular submeasure are averaged as well. So for instance, if we look at the submeasure of student empowerment, every question under student empowerment had an overall score. Those were all measured, or those were all averaged to result in the 87 overall score. Then we can see moving up, school events had an overall average of 94, school climate 78, and teacher expectations 96. When these four sub-measures are averaged, that leads to the overall measure score of 89. And then if we were to average the three overall measures, we get the overall culture score. So everything is a progression of averaging scores from individual question results to submeasures to measures, and ultimately to the category and overall Leader in Me MRA result. Now, a few things to keep in mind about the measurable results assessment. Remember that the data provided is school level data. So this is data that pertains to the overall school. It is not possible to obtain individual or classroom level data. That's not really the end in mind of the MRA. So everything we're looking at is, again, a picture of the whole school. Also, we want to keep in mind that these MRA results shown on these reports are not a grade, and they're in no way a way to rate or rank Leader in Me schools. It's really just useful data for a school to determine what are the areas of celebration that they should be proud of and want to celebrate as a school, and what are potential areas of growth that they may choose to include as part of their school improvement plan. So the overall data that's been collected is really just used to guide the school improvement efforts. Now, should you like to get more information about the MRA and the results, you have several sources. First of all, on the website, there is an MRA user guide. This provides much more information on everything that we've talked about today. Then we can also go into the homepage of leaderinme.com, and if we click on featured collections under the My Classroom category, we will go to the featured collections, and then we can select the measurable results assessment collection. And that contains a variety of documents that can help us better understand the MRA. You're also encouraged to contact your regional lead coach for additional information. These coaches are very familiar with administering and interpreting the MRA. So thank you so much for your attention today, and we wish you much luck with the use of the MRA.